Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome, and today we're speaking to Gideon Haigh, who is an author and journalist, and he's written many books on cricket and history, but his latest book is The Brilliant Boy, Doc Evatt and the Great Australian Descent. And today we are going to speak about Doc Evatt, aren't we, Gideon? And who was a contemporary of Robert Menzies.
Indeed, he was. He was sort of the anti-Menzies, or his counterpart, his foil, and his nemesis. But two fascinating Australians, two very distinguished Australians, both born in 1894, sort of equally eminent on opposite sides of politics and in the law, and in some ways, I think, sort of maybe even defined each other in contradistinction to the other. If Evatt hadn't existed, Menzies would have had to invent him.
Last night, I just did a quick kind of list of all their similarities, and obviously, yes, yeah, right. Born in exactly the same year. They were both children of families of not very great means, so they were brilliant students and then scholarship boys. Won scholarships to university at a time when you really could only go to university if you were the child of wealthy parents or on a scholarship. They were both presidents of their university student unions. Both didn't serve in World War I for different reasons. Both became brilliant lawyers, then came up against each other, I guess for the first time in the incredibly famous and the biggest sort of constitutional law case in the 1920s, the Engineers case, where Menzies prevailed, acting for the
Union.
The Union, yes, rather ironically. Both became King's Counsel, the youngest in their respective states, Menzies in Victoria and Evatt in New South Wales, at exactly the same age. Yes. Evatt pipped Menzies to become a High Court judge, the youngest at 36. But then both were patrons and great lovers of the arts. Both served as Attorney General of Australia. Both loved cricket. Both loved reading and learning. Both had incredibly close relationships with their wives. And then looking at the Menzies book collection, so we have Menzies Personal Library here at the Robert Menzies Institute at the Baillieu Library at the University of Melbourne. There are 7 of Evatt's books in that collection, and some Evatt has written inscriptions into Menzies. And of course, when Evatt died, he predeceased Menzies, I think, by about 13 years or so.
13 years? Yeah.
Menzies was one of his pallbearers. And I did a podcast the other day, Gideon, on the communism referendum, and we were talking about the fact that Evatt really only had one win over Menzies in his career. He, rather bizarrely, as opposition leader, appeared on behalf of some I think Communist Party affiliated unions in the High Court to basically plead the case that the Communist Party Dissolution Act that the Menzies government had passed was unconstitutional, and he won. And he felt it was the biggest and most important battle. And I spoke about this with Professor George Williams from the University of New South Wales, constitutional law professor. But it's an incredible story of two huge figures who had so much in common, but were, of course, complete nemesis of each other. And you've written beautifully about, or an aspect of Evatt's career, of course, his when he was a judge, and the decision he handed down, a dissenting decision in a very, very tragic case, one of the leading tort cases that I learnt about here, probably in this building in the old quad at Melbourne University. Yeah. But Gideon, I thought I'd start our conversation by talking about how Evatt had a tough start in life, a pretty tragic family history, losing his father and his brothers. How do you think that affected his worldview?
Well, I think yeah, we're talking about a very, very different time in Australia. It's a pre-antibiotic era. It's an era that encompasses 2 world wars. I think everyone grew up with a greater or lesser sense of their own mortality. As you say, 4 of Evatt's brothers were gone by his mid-20s. His father died when he was 6, and his mother also died in the early 1920s. I think someone who's grown up under those circumstances is entitled to a sense of the precariousness of human life, and also the preciousness of children. And there's no doubt that one of Evatt's chief characteristics was a great sentimentality and a great protectiveness of children. He certainly showed it towards his own children, both of whom were adopted. But he, as his longtime associate John Brennan said, he loved nothing more than watching children at play. He found them fascinating. He found them very endearing. He found their characteristics fascinating to observe. In some respects, if you wanted a judge to be deliberating on an important tort case involving the traumatic loss of a child, Evatt is exactly the judge that you would call for if you were the plaintiff.
It's extraordinary to reflect on how he would have coped with all those tragedies. And then, in reading your book, you're painting a picture of someone who in a lot of respects could have become quite a conservative figure. And I was interested to read in your book that people were quite surprised when he joined the Labor Party and said he wanted to be a Labor politician. He could have quite equally been a member of, at the time it would have been the Nationalists, wouldn't it?
Yes.
He wasn't a naturally, it wasn't from a union background. Clearly, he wasn't obviously from a family of affluence, but his worldview was as a small L liberal, wasn't it? Fundamentally,
yes, it was. Yeah. It's a very different time to ours, of course, and in some respects, Evatt is quite conservative by modern lights. He was a believer in the White Australia policy. He believed in, he wasn't a Republican, believed unstintingly in Australia's connection to the Crown. A lot of things that are sort of what we regard as key left-wing concerns now, Evatt was completely unacquainted with and uninterested. There was actually lots of common ground between Menzies and Evatt, as you say. Both lovers of learning, both lovers of literature, quite traditional in their educational attainments. So perhaps it was the fact that once one of them was on one side of the politics, there was no room for the other one in the same place.
I wonder if that is the case. Was the first time they met in the engineers case? Do you think, or would they have come across each other before that? They were obviously both greatly successful barristers, but they were very young when they started appearing in the High Court. Yeah.
They were, of course, and one was in Melbourne and one was in Sydney, and the circles of law in both those cities were very, very tight knit. One of the things that does strike you when you write about this period, though, is that everyone knows everybody else.
Yes, Australia was a small country. The circles of influence in
Australia very small, and constantly meeting, constantly overlapping, constantly working in different areas but coming up against the same people. The fact that Menzies and Evatt were both interested in art introduced them to circles of artists and creative people who you wouldn't necessarily have access to now if you were a High Court judge or an eminent politician.
No, it is really interesting how the sort of, I guess, elite in Australia, be it from business, politics, law, were constantly engaging with each other and influencing each other. I found it really interesting in your book that you're talking about how all these eminent lawyers had such an impact on Australia's policy development and were so well known in Australia for their contribution to the development of ideas in Australia, where I think in sort of contemporary life most people wouldn't have a clue who are the eminent barristers, who are the judges of the land. They just wouldn't make the news, it wouldn't make the papers. We're obviously a country of many, many times more population.
was going to say a key character they had in common was Owen Dixon.
Yeah.
Because Owen Dixon was Menzies' hero, his legal hero, his kind of bellwether of lawyers, and he was also Evatt's colleague, most admired colleague on the High Court bench. It was fascinating that Dixon could get on so well or work so productively with both men, but he was a man of a very secure sense of his own importance, Dixon, at the same time. So I think he probably quite enjoyed that the two of those individuals naturally deferred to him.
Yeah, yes, I'm sure he did. And of course, then Justice Dixon was on the High Court when the communism case came before him.
Yes.
Where obviously Menzies as Prime Minister wanting the legislation to be upheld by the High Court, and Evatt as opposition leader and as the lead counsel for some of the unions appealing for its declaration as invalid. And so again, that would have been a very, very interesting sort of grouping of three very influential people and significant legal minds coming together and clashing over what would have been the biggest issue of the day.
Yeah, at least Stark and Rich had moved on by that stage. Hayden Stark and George Rich apparently stayed on the High Court for long enough merely to prevent Evatt replacing them as Attorney General.
He was a figure, and like Menzies, I'm sure, who divided opinion, didn't he? He didn't have the natural charm of Curtin. He was pretty critical of Curtin, wasn't he? But obviously a massive intellect. You write about him being one of the sort of smartest people in the land, the smartest people in the law. And what a gift to Australia that people like Evatt and Menzies gave up so much of their life to public service.
Yes, yeah. I think one of the interesting things about a country like Australia is that it's so young that lots of things have to be done for the first time.
Yes.
And both Menzies and Evatt could see that need, understood the importance of the mechanics of sort of social maturation. In some respects, Australia is better off for having the both of them to act as kind of striking sparks off one another through the relevant period.
Yeah, both committed to the nation-building project of Australia, I think, obviously coming at it from different perspectives, but also similar perspectives too. I wondered if we could talk about Evatt's journey to the High Court. Amazing at the age of 36 to be appointed to the High Court. He hasn't been outdone in terms of his youth, has he?
No, he hasn't. No.
And I don't think he ever will be now. What were the sort of qualities that Evatt embodied that enabled him to rise so quickly to the High Court, do you think, Gideon?
Well, of course, it's a much smaller bar in those days, isn't it? I think there are only 600 barristers or something in Sydney at the time that Evatt went to the bar, so it was easier to stand out. You were able to handle very important cases very young. That's why both Menzies and Evatt end up appearing in Engineers. It's also a period when pleadings are becoming more important in the law, and the role of adept junior counsel is becoming more significant. So Evatt and Menzies were both able to achieve note early on by having an intellectual bandwidth that maybe some of the older lawyers, some of the actual silks at the bench were unable to achieve. I think the other thing is that Evatt chose high-profile cases in which to appear. You know, he was involved in the Irish Envoys case. He was involved in the Walsh and Johnson deportation case. He identified with certain issues, and he understood that they were important issues of principle to be fought. But he also understood that they were the kind of cases that naturally achieved note. And he was an exceedingly ambitious man. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Evatt never saw a job to which he didn't immediately think himself the best suited person. And he also wasn't shy about, letting people know that. He was, there's a certain naivety and a bumptiousness about Evatt. Doesn't really understand the sensitivities of others, alienates others, and it's a characteristic that grows worse as he gets older. Menzies had it in a certain degree, but Menzies also had that surface affability, and that he did have an understanding of what motivated others and an ability to argue out principles. The other thing is, there's really on the Labor side of politics, once Evatt goes into it, he has no natural intellectual kin. As you say, he's not a man from a trade union background. He's not a man with working class roots. He's a man who's arrived at his political leanings by intellectual processes, not by birth or occupation. And that makes him a bit of a one out on that side of it. It leaves him short of the capacities necessary to create alliances, to build consensuses, and to manage a party room, a notoriously febrile party room in Labor's case.
Yeah, and he famously falls out, doesn't he, with Jack Lang, and then has to run when he's in state politics and has to run as a independent Labor candidate. I mean, he doesn't necessarily have a lot of fellow travellers in the Labor movement. He's sort of intellectually.
Well, not a Jack Lang.
No,
It wasn't. It didn't make him unique falling out with Jack Lang. Just about everyone.
Which maybe is a feather in his cap, really.
Yeah. Well, he was
on the right side of history. Yes. Indeed. A lot of the adjectives you were using to describe Evatt, his sort of enormous self-confidence, his difficulty getting on with others, and I guess an arrogance that he always considered himself the best person for the job. It's very much a description of the younger Menzies. Menzies benefited hugely, in my view, from being forced to resign the leadership and prime ministership in 41. And those periods in the wilderness, like for other leaders too, or fallen leaders, when they come back, they're better for it. Ability to sort of moderate his natural tendencies to tick off others. And I mean, I think there still was that in Menzies Mark II, but he learnt the value of the backbench, the value of a coalition partner, and how to work those relationships to his advantage. And of course, that art of persuasion that he was so adept at came from a lot about being able to build those sort of common bonds of trust with everyday Australians, and being able to kind of really articulate what was resonating in the sort of kitchens and shops and churches and town halls across Australia, which was perhaps not a quality that ever developed throughout his career. Never having to rise to the prime ministership in the end. He kept being thwarted by Menzies.
Well, certain aspects of the law certainly suited Evatt's mind or his approach, that kind of the role of the individual virtuoso, the capacity to the gravitation towards the freelance lifestyle, the belief in a compelling idea and the capacity to articulate it, the capacity to go off on your own, basically, none of which were useful for him in politics.
No.
Despite perhaps, I think, his occasional inability to understand that.
One of the times when Menzies and Evatt would have come up against each other intellectually was the Egon Kisch case, of course, the case of the Czech communist activist who was attempting and did visit Australia. Menzies was Attorney General at the time in the Lyons government in the 30s and attempted to block Egon Kisch from visiting Australia. Egon Kisch and his supporters appealed this, and Evatt was on the High Court at the time, wasn't he? These battles over communism are such a feature of the Evatt v Menzies story, aren't they? Egon Kisch case, and then on to the Communist Party dissolution bill, and then, of course, the referendum on communism, and then all that flowed from that, the Petrov affair, and then, really the Menzies sort of eviscerating Evatt on the floor of Parliament and over communism, and the kind of crumbling of Evatt all came down to the issue of communism in the 30s, 40s and 50s.
Well, I think it more probably comes down to the idea of a freedom of political expression. You know, one of the obsessions that Evatt had, one of his slogans that he constantly repeated was this line from Milton: "Let truth and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth to be put to worse in an open encounter." He believed that it was often, I think, mistaken for an indulgence of communism, that he believed that communism should be able to compete in the public square of ideas, and that its prevention or its illegality or its stifling was not something that a country like Australia should be party to. I think that part of Evatt was naive about communism, that's for sure. Certainly, its Soviet variant. But I think he also he loved this idea, and once again it goes back to this his lawyer's mentality, the idea that you would hear from both sides of an argument, and that eventually the deliberative mechanism or the individual would make a decision based on how convincing that argument was. Politics doesn't often work that way, but the law does. So in some respects, it was another naivety of Evatt's that he expected this principle of the law to be transposed immediately into politics.
Yeah, indeed. But also, you have to give him credit for the campaign that he and others waged in the communism referendum. I think that when it was first announced that there would be a communism referendum, there was something like 80% support for changing the constitution, and this was championed by Menzies, of course. And Evatt, among others, campaigned no. And I mean, look, the history of Australia and referendums is such that it's almost certain that it will be a no vote. Yeah. So maybe he was always going to win. But it was line ball in the end. I think it was something like 51-49. It was really, really line ball in terms of the popular vote. But that must have been showing, at least in that issue, that Evatt was adept in the art of persuading an enormous portion of that population to change their mind from the initial polling results. And even people who completely opposed communism, I think my grandmother, for example, would have always been a Liberal voter. She was married to a Liberal MP, but she voted no. My grandfather voted yes to change the constitution, but she voted no. There you go. And her husband was even in the Menzies Parliament and ministry at the time. So,
what a great country this is, Georgina.
Exactly. No, and look, I think, history will show it was the best outcome for the country. We're a free country. We shouldn't ban political parties or political ideologies. It should be the battle of ideas that is played out on the street and in the media and wherever, and let the people decide. But became a sort of obsession for Evatt, and obviously, didn't realise the longer term consequences for his reputation and what he would be associated with in Australia, and then of course his undoing in the end.
Could not have foreseen the valences of the Cold War.
Yes,
I think that's one of the great challenges of writing books about his historical books and biographies, is that you have to. Although life can only be understood backwards, it has to be lived forwards. You actually have to be able to place yourself in the position of these people as they're making the decisions without any understanding of the way in which the future is going to unfold. It's kind of, and in some respects, the brilliant boy, because it does concentrate on Evatt in this period, this sort of peak Evatt period of the 1930s up to his going back into politics. It's kind of fascinating, even though I know what happens. When I went to read it, it was quite compelling. If you sort of stood alongside Evatt and scanned the horizon of the future, hopefully with expectations of Australia and a belief in the power of ideas, you could actually feel that what he was accomplishing was quite inspirational.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a challenge for, especially here we're at the Robert Menzies Institute, where we exist to generate debate and discussion on a figure of the past, very, very significant figure in Australia's history, who made decisions that were of their time, and some of them have had enduring positive impacts. Some look, history will judge were wrong, or could have been done better. But do you judge past historical figures on with the values of today, and condemn them where they fall foul of the values of 2021? Incredibly challenging, and I mean something that, of course, is the subject of many debates here on a university campus. When we, look at all the sort of issues of tearing down statues and monuments, you've got to question the benefit of that when you then tear down the reminders of what went well, but also what went badly, and all in between. I think it's important to remember these people, statues, memorials, libraries, museums. They don't necessarily have to be about a hagiography. It's a moment to have that discussion and reflection.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's interesting to read the biographies of the figures that we're talking about over time. The first Evatt biography was written back in 1970 by Kylie Tennant. It's a very different book to the John Murphy book that was published 4 or 5 years ago, and a different book again to the book that I've written. I think the same goes for the Menzies books, the early Menzies books. I suppose the instant stuff like the Kevin Perkins book and the Cameron Hazelhurst book, they're very different to the Martin book and to Judith Brett's book and now to Troy Bramston's book. Every generation feels a need to reinterpret its historical figures according to the imperatives of the moment, but the best of them are always capable of trying to walk alongside their character and judge the choices that they made in the context of their times.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, and that's why they are endlessly interesting. You can read a biography of Menzies, and know the facts and figures, sure, the key events, but it's at what point in time was that written, and what does that reflect about the views of the author, but also what's going on in the world at that time that influences the interpretation of that figure of the past. Gideon, I wanted to go to the court case that Evatt heard as a High Court judge, Chester and Waverley Council, that is the focus of your wonderful book, a tragic case. If you'd like to talk through some of the facts of the case, I think that would be really interesting for our listeners. But then I also wanted you to tell us, what does Chester and Waverley Council tell us about Australian society at the time? I think there is so much we need to reflect on about what was going on in Australia at that period.
Yeah, look, it's the circumstances of the case are very tragic and very easily imagined. It was a Saturday afternoon in August 1937. It was a working class suburb of Waverley in New South Wales, a little sort of suburban enclave. Kids went running into the street to play out from under their parents' supervision. There were 3 children in the Chester family. They were recently arrived Polish emigre Jews, originally called Sokochevsky. That anglicised their names. There was 15-year-old Benny, there was 12-year-old Rose, and there was 7-year-old Maxie. The 2 older siblings went off to the movies and left their younger sibling to fend for himself. They came back in the afternoon, but he did not. There was a sort of a house-to-house search in the neighbourhood, as often happens when a child goes missing. Eventually, the search concentrated itself around a trench that had been dug on the corner of Allen's Parade by some council workers to put a PMG conduit down. It had filled with water the previous week from heavy rain, and kids had been observed earlier in the day jumping from side to side because it was not adequately fenced off. And the police eventually turned up, and Maxie's body was fished from the bottom of the trench. The mother, Golda Chester, saw it happening, so saw her son's body being extracted from the depths. She didn't have a cause of action or immediately obvious cause of action because in those days, under what was called the Compensation for Relatives Act in New South Wales, you could only sue for financial loss in the event of the loss of a child. And Maxie, being 7, was not working, so the family had financially given up nothing. Abe Lander, who was a sort of a pioneering solicitor in the area of workers' compensation, seized on the idea of taking an action, seeking compensation for the nervous shock that Golda Chester experienced from seeing her child's body on the day in question. Her trauma, if you like. In that sense, it's a very modern case. You know, we call it trauma now. Back in those days, we called it nervous shock. It's a kind of a quaint, old-fashioned term. It actually originates in the middle of the 19th century. But we still actually talk about nervous shock cases these days. And the law doesn't change readily.
No.
And the law didn't in this place either, because once the case got to the High Court, the majority decided that she had no case. She didn't deserve any compensation. It was only Evatt who said that, you know what, I actually think that she does, and for these reasons. And he gives a very, very compelling judgment, not only very elegantly written, but very, very rigorously argued. I don't think there's any sense that, as is sometimes said of judges, that he's let the head give in to the heart. It's an empathic judgment for sure, but it's also an extremely clever judgment. Mm. I didn't do law, unlike you. I sort of had to school myself in torts in order to do this book. I just came away from it thinking, boy, oh boy, that's really smart. I really like the way this guy's mind thinks. And I'd always been interested in Evatt. You know, I've read all the biographies. I'm quite interested in political history. I'd never been able to sort of put my finger on why he was so admired, because I was looking at his career backwards. Like a lot of people, I knew him primarily as an opposition leader in the 1950s, where he'd been Menzies' hapless punching bag.
Yeah.
I could never quite understand what people had seen in Doc Evatt in the first place. Anyway, when I read The Dissent, I thought, this explains it. This explains it because this is a very high-quality mind at work towards a just outcome. And in jurisprudential terms, it's really pretty remarkable in Australia. So I thought, once I read it, I thought, okay, I've got an aperture through which to view Evatt in a new light. I can kind of, I've found an entry point, and from there I can kind of work outwards.
Well, I think an incredibly clever way of looking at a figure that is, at least for political history junkies in Australia, he's a familiar figure. But as you said, you've opened up a part of his life that is under-examined, and you've actually shone a light on probably his most brilliant side. And if you are an Evatt fan, it surely is one of the things he should be most remembered for, is being a brilliant legal mind, being someone who was deeply committed to that sense of justice for the mother, but also obviously terribly caring of children. I mean, in this case, we're talking about a child who lost his life, but the impact that has on the family and the broader community. And look, he had the dissenting judgment in this case, but his judgment was subsequently in, I think, was it the 1980s? Was actually in the end adopted by the High Court and became the
Gents versus Coffey in 1984.
Thank you.
The other interesting thing, Georgina, is that it does express something about Evatt's belief in Australia.
Yeah,
his idea that we did not simply have to be a subsidiary of empire. We didn't have to wait for other jurisdictions to make decisions in important areas of the law. This was a case where Australia, as a new country, as a relatively new country, could take a lead, could actually be original. And this was, the huge size of Evatt's ego is that he did see himself on par with the great jurists of Britain and the United States, and saw no reason why he should not be an original thinker in this area. If that was what his peers were doing overseas, then why shouldn't he?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating perspective, and look, and when you think of his career, I mean, being president of the United Nations General Assembly, he became a figure, not least in jurisprudential terms, but in international politics and international affairs, he became a significant figure, like Menzies did. So there's that sense that Australia, it's a young country, part of the British Empire, part of the Commonwealth of Nations. There's a kind of, I guess, derivative part of Australia's story in that we're derivative of Britain, but this was Australian people, Australian nationals going out and making an impact on the world stage, be it in common law, be it in international affairs, and look, that's incredibly important for the story of Australia's development as a modern nation on the international stage.
I think also one other thing is one of the interesting things, he uses decisions by two jurists that he really admired in the case. He uses the Donoghue versus Stevenson judgment by Lord Atkin
the snail in the bottle.
An Anglo-Australian with whom he'd been in regular contact, and Benjamin Cardozo in Wagner versus International Railways. He'd been to America and Britain in 1938. He'd sort of hung around with the great jurists and leading political figures of those two countries. It's almost as though, from Evatt's perspective, we can have the best of both worlds here. We can choose from Britain. We can choose from America. We can be our own. We can be our own selves here. We're nation building, and we don't simply have to follow in any particular footsteps. We can choose the best of everything.
I think that's a lovely way of encapsulating what Australia was aspiring to be at the time, and Australian society was going through enormous changes at that time. I mean, still does, I guess, but really dramatic changes, and trying to carve out its own identity too. Separate to Britain, separate to the United States, where we didn't quite have the same, obviously, bonds of history. But that was we have our own particular geographic position too, so we're carving out this very unique identity for ourselves through all these different avenues, which is really important for where we are today. It's interesting, Gideon, to reflect on the fact that Evatt sort of went from law to politics so fluidly. We almost don't see that at all, and you can't even imagine in a contemporary context one of the judges on the High Court these days deciding I'm going to resign and now go into federal politics, and not just go into federal politics, become the opposition leader for 9 years. What was that considered appropriate at the time? I mean, the High Court is, of course, supposed to... Well, the judiciary in Australia is supposed to be independent and impartial, and it's not supposed to be an inclination of a political persuasion at all. That would question, of course, the independence of the judiciary, which is absolutely fundamental to Australian democracy. But tell me, what are your reflections on this, on Evatt's transition from High Court judge to politics?
Well, when we say that he transitioned, he actually, in the early part of his career, he didn't transition at all. He continued to be a KC while he was a New South Wales parliamentarian. Well,
as did Menzies. Yeah,
and they were, and people actually thought that was a good idea. Yeah. Who wanted to, the idea of actually paying for politicians, how extraordinary that they could do it professionally.
Didn't Evatt, he actually opposed a move to change sitting hours from the evening to the daytime, because that would have interfered with his career at the bar.
Exactly. So it does say something about our relationship to politicians in this country, that those things bided for such a long period. Abe Lander too, who was the solicitor in Chester's case, I don't think gave up his legal practice until he'd been in Parliament for 15 years. He continued to be one of Sydney's leading workers' compensation lawyers, even while he was a Labor politician in New South Wales. So, yeah, look, there are all sorts of things that we look upon askance from our current vantage, thinking, of course, that we're doing it. We've got it right now. We've got it sorted. But there were reasons, and there were understandings, and I think providing everyone knew what everyone else was doing, and the rules were the same for everyone, then there wasn't much imperative to change it.
I wanted to finish off our discussion, Gideon, by asking you to reflect on how you think Evatt should be remembered as obviously a significant jurist, an incredible legal intellect, one of Australia's most important figures in the development of the United Nations, an opposition leader for 9 years, incredibly important figure in the Labor Party history. Obviously, his championing of freedom of association and free speech in Australia through his work on the communism issue. I mean, there's lots of things, but what do you think are the things he should be most remembered for?
Well, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about Evatt and Menzies is that in 1944-45, when they were about 40 years old, which of them would you have said at the time was likely to be the more distinguished Australian? At that stage, Menzies is languishing in the political wilderness. He's had one unsuccessful premiership, and his reputation is being restored, but not quickly. Evatt looks as though he's one step short of the prime ministership. He is a man who has done nothing but advance. He's never really had a setback in his life. Everything he's taken, apart from probably that abortive stint in New South Wales politics, has been a success for him. He looks like the man of destiny, Evatt, in 1945. So I guess in that sense, their respective tales, Menzies and Evatt, are injunctions never to take anything for granted and never to give up. Because things can change. The times will suit you, as Georgina once said. I think the way to remember him now, and I would do it in a broad brush way, is to say he was just an incredibly clever Australian. And we don't really respect cleverness in this country as much as we should. We like bravery, we like innovation, we like success in sport, success in culture, but people who distinguish themselves just sheerly by mental bandwidth are rare. In fact, we are a bit suspicious of cleverness in Australia. We think it's a little bit effete, a little bit frivolous.
Yes.
We hammer away at things like we're pragmatic and we're authentic. That's part of the argot of modern politics. I don't think Evatt would ever have used those descriptions of himself, and probably no one would have attached pragmatic to him. He was highly idealistic.
Yes.
And it would never have occurred to him to call himself authentic. Well, of course he was authentic.
Yeah.
In fact, anyone who has to say that they're authentic
is automatically inauthentic.
Yes. Yeah. So I like the fact that Evatt kind of points to a different way to be Australian, an unusual way, a defiantly independent way to be Australian, just by being clever. And in Evatt's case, he loved using the word just.
Yeah.
He loved the idea of just, not legal, just. And in Chester's case, what he's saying is, okay, I'm going to start from what I think is a just conclusion, and I'm going to work backwards through the law. I'm going to use the law to engender a just outcome. That's creative. That's actually creative. That's not just grinding the gears of law. That's actually using your imagination and your breadth of vision to make a better country. He offers a kind of Australianness that we don't often honour. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we haven't honoured him as much as we could. He's a kind of an Australian sui generis. He actually gave me a way of looking at Australia where I saw our kind of strengths and weaknesses. He was an embodiment of both.
Yes. what an extraordinary tale, and thank you, Gideon Haigh, for writing this book. I think it's a real gift to our nation to understand an important personality, someone, of course, from the Robert Menzies Institute's perspective, someone who's incredibly important to the story of modern Australia and the Menzies era, and you've written it so beautifully. So it's been a pleasure to have you on the Afternoon Light podcast. And,
thanks for your interest.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.